Hello students. So students, in the previous part we had started with a new chapter. This was chapter number 13. The name of this chapter was organisms and population. So previously in the last session we started studying about ecology and we studied the basic concept about it. Then we moved on to organisms and the environment around these organisms. We also studied about the basic difference between habitat and niche, and then we studied the explanation, the detailed explanation about habitat and niche. We also studied about the three types of niche that are found in the ecosystem. And then we moved on to the major abiotic factors in the ecosystem, that is temperature, water, light and soil. And lastly, we also studied about certain possibilities that are present in the environment for an organism to survive and flourish. So the possibilities such as regulate, conform, migrate and suspend. So this was about the previous part, what we have studied in the previous session. In today's session, we are moving to the last part of this chapter where we will be studying about adaptation first. Now what is adaptation? To cope up with an extreme variation in the environment, there are some organisms that respond to this variation through physiological adjustment. That means they adjust their body physiologically. And there are some organisms that show behavioral changes. When we speak about behavioral changes, the best example is of migration. And when we are speaking about migration, the best example to study migration is the flamingo birds. So flamingo birds visiting to the shallow creeks on the west coast of Mumbai is one example to study adaptation. Now during the month of December to May, there are a lot of these flamingo birds that actually migrate from Kutch in Gujarat to Mumbai, to the west coast of Mumbai. Okay? And why do they do so? Because the temperature and the environmental condition in Mumbai during these months are very favorable for these birds for feeding and breeding. And let me tell you, it is one of the best experience and everyone should, have this experience once in their lifetime. This takes place in the month of December to May. You will find all these flamingo birds to the shivery west coast in Mumbai. Okay, so this is adaptation. So one such behavioral change that is seen in flamingos is an example of adaptation. If we speak about plants, there are many desert plants that have thick cuticle on their leaf surface and they have stomata which is in deep pits. Now this is to minimize the loss of water due to transpiration, correct? And this is also one of their adaptation to the environment. Now there are also some special photosynthetic pathway like CAM pathway, which is known as crassulacean acid metabolism. Okay, this is also a certain adaptation that is done by plants. Again, if we take example of a desert plant, the most common desert plant, that is Apansia, which you commonly call as cactus plant. Now these cactus plant or Apansia plants, they have leaves which have been reduced, that means they have been modified into spines. So these spines that you see, these are leaves which are actually modified in the form of spines. This is due to the environmental condition. There is a lot of heat in the desert plant, and this plant, the desert area and this particular plant, it has to protect itself and it has to minimize the loss of water which takes place due to transpiration. And so they have modified themselves in a way that their leaves are reduced in the form of spines. Then the question arises that how is photosynthesis process taking place in them? So the photosynthetic function in these plants are taken over by the flat stems. So the stem, which are known as phylloclades, they get modified into this flat structure, which are green in color, and they do the photosynthetic process. So this is also an adaptation that is seen in Apantia plant. Then again, if we take examples of animals, mammals in the colder climate, they generally have very short snout, they have short ears, short tail, and their limbs are also very short. This is again to minimize the loss of body heat. In colder climate, they have to maintain this body heat to survive, and to survive in that cold climate, their parts of their body are reduced. The parts of their body are small. Again, in polar seas, the aquatic mammals like seals. Seals, they have this thick layer of fat below their skin. And this thick layer of fat, it acts as an insulator. This is again to reduce the loss of body heat. Now, this was about physiological changes that the organism shows. There are some organisms that even show behavioral changes. And this is again to cope up with the variation that takes place in the environment. Now for this, the best example that we can take of the kangaroo rat. Kangaroo rat, which is usually found in desert areas, during daytime these rats, they burrow themselves into the sand to hide and to escape from the heat of the sun. Okay, so this is one of the behavioral change that an organism shows to adapt in an environment. So students, this was about adaptation. Next, we'll be studying about population. So in nature, we rarely find isolated single individuals. The individuals, they live in groups, which is in a well-defined geographical area, and they share or they compete for similar resources, potential interbreed, and thus they form a population. So although it is an individual organism that has to cope up with the changes in the environment, it is at that population level that natural selection operates to evolve the described trait. Now if we speak about population ecology it is therefore an important area of ecology because it actually links the ecology to population dynamics and genetic and evolution taking place in that population. Now a population, it has certain attributes of its own which are different from those of an individual. Basic physical characteristic, if we speak about basic physical characteristic of a population, it is size and density. Where size, it speaks about the number of individuals in that particular population, and if we speak about density, density tells us about the number of individuals present per unit space in a given time. Now beside these two physical characteristics like size and density, there are other characteristics that includes natality, mortality, immigration, emigration, age pyramid, expanding population, population growth form, and biotic potential. Now let us study about these other physical characteristics as well. So the first one is natality. Natality, it is the birth rate of a population, and it has the greatest influence on a population's growth. Natality is a crude birth rate or it is a specific birth rate. What do you mean by a crude birth rate? Crude birth rate, it is used when calculating population size, that is number of birth per thousand population per year. And when we speak about specific birth rate, this is used relative to specific criterion such as age. For this, the example is that if in a pond there were 200 carp fish last year, and through a reproductive phase there are 800 new carp fish that have been added to the same pond. And now taking the current population as 1000, 800 plus 200, so the current population becomes 1000. We calculate the birth rate as 800 by 200, that is 4 offsprings per calf per year. This is specific birth rate. Then the term comes absolute natality and realized natality. Absolute natality, it is the number of birth under ideal condition. That means when the conditions are favorable for birth. That means when we speak about favorable condition, that means when there is no competition at all, and then when there is abundance of resources like food, water, shelter for an organism to grow, for a population to grow. This is absolute natality. Then what is realized natality? This is the number of birth when environmental pressure comes into play. That means when the conditions are completely unfavorable, when there is limited resources like food and water, during that time the number of birth that takes place in that environmental pressure is known as realized natality. And it must be remembered that the absolute natality, that means the number of birth taking place in ideal condition, is always more than the realized natality. Next characteristic is mortality. Mortality is the death rate of a population. And mortality rate or the death rate, it is measured the number of deaths. Now these deaths can be due to any specific cause, or it can be in general. Okay, so mortality rate or the death rate, it is measured as the number of deaths in a particular population in proportion to the size of the population per unit time. And this mortality rate or the death rate, it is typically expressed in deaths per 1000 individuals per year. Now again the term comes absolute mortality and realized mortality. Absolute mortality is the number of deaths under ideal condition. Ideal conditions are when there is no competition and when there is abundance of resources such as food and water. During such time also, during a favorable condition also, if deaths are taking place, this is known as absolute mortality. Then what is realized mortality? Realized mortality is when there is number of deaths when there is environmental pressure. Okay, environmental pressure, that means there can be any certain cause, there can be limited resources, there will be certain competition, there will be some spread of disease or anything like that. So if deaths are taking place during such unfavorable condition, it is known as realized mortality. And again it must be remembered that absolute mortality, that means deaths taking place in ideal condition, is always less than the realized mortality. Okay, the best example for this you can take as this COVID-19 pandemic. The deaths that have been taking place during these months due to the coronavirus, due to COVID-19 pandemic, is the realized mortality, and it is always more than the deaths that takes place in ideal condition when there is no such widespread of disease and when there is ideal and favorable condition. So this is mortality. The next term, the next characteristic that we need to study is sex ratio. Sex ratio, it is measured as the ratio of number of individuals of one sex to that of the other sex. And the sex ratio of a population, it affects and it is reciprocally affected by birth, death, immigration and emigration rate. Now the male and the female in a ratio of 1:1 is generally the most common evolutionary stable strategy that is taken into consideration. Okay, so this is about the sex ratio. We have studied about three physical characteristics: natality, mortality and sex ratio. Next, let us study about age distribution and age pyramid. Now, a population, it is composed of individuals of different age groups. Okay, and if the age distribution, that is percent individuals of a given age or a particular age group, it is plotted for the population. The resulting structure is known as age pyramid. So these are the age pyramids in this picture. As you can see, that these are the age pyramids of different countries. Okay. Now, for the purpose of simplicity, the entire population, okay, for the purpose of simplicity, the entire population, it is divided into 3 age groups. The first one is pre-reproductive age group, that is the age group between 0 to 14 years. Okay. Now this is the age group when a person or an individual is incapable of reproducing. Then comes the second age group, that is reproductive age group, where the individual is able to or it is capable to reproduce. That is the age group between 15 to 44. And then is the post-reproductive age group, that is 45 to 85 plus of years. Okay. So for the purpose of simplicity of this entire population, this is how it is divided. Now the size of a population, it can be supported, or the size of the population that the population supports, it actually tells us a lot about the status in that habitat. The population size in natural habitat could be as low as 10, and it can go to millions. Okay. And this population size, it more technically called as population density, that is designated as N, need not necessarily be measured in numbers only. Okay. So this is about age distribution and age pyramid. Next, let us study about population growth. Now the size of a population of a particular species in a dynamic parameter, it keeps on changing with time depending on various factors like food, predation pressure, then there can be adverse weather condition, and these changes in population density, that gives us some idea whether the population is flourishing or it is declining. Now density of a population is a habitat during a given period of time, and this fluctuates due to the changes in 4 basic processes. This population density can change, it can fluctuate in 4 basic processes. The first one is new birth. If there is new birth that is taking place, that is denoted as B, or if there is immigration. What is immigration? It is the number of individuals of the same species that have come to a particular habitat from some other habitat. They are immigrating to a particular population. They are coming and staying in a particular population. So this is one process. If there is new birth and if there is immigration, this contributes to the increase in population because there is adding of individuals in these two cases. There are new individuals that are introduced into a population. Other process is deaths and emigration. Now death and emigration. Emigration is the number of individuals of a population who have left that particular habitat or who have left that particular population. And in this case, this leads to a decrease in population. Okay? Because in both the cases of death and immigration, there is, reduction of the individuals in a particular population. So if you have to calculate the population density, that is N, at a time T, then the density of time T plus L can be calculated using this particular formula. Okay? So this is population growth. Next, there are two growth models that we have to study. Now here the question arises that does the growth of a population with time shows any specific predictable pattern? Because we have been concerned about the increasing human population growth and the problems that are created by it in our country, and it is therefore very natural for us to be curious if the animal population in nature behaves the same way or they show some restraint or growth. For this, we have to study the two growth models over here. The first one is exponential growth. Now, every species They are capable of growing exponentially under unlimited resources and reach enormous population density in a short time. Resources such like food, space are essential for any growth of a population. And ideally, when the resources are in an habitat is unlimited, that means there is abundance of resources. Each of these species, they have an ability to fully realize their innate potential and grow in number. At such ideal condition, the population that grows is in an exponential proportion. That means it is in a geometric proportion. So as you can see in this graph, the population size with the given time, it is increasing, it is doubling. This is what is exponential growth. Then comes the logistic growth. Now, competition between individuals for a limited resource, this will weed out, of course, the weaker ones, and only the fittest one in the environment, the fittest individual in the environment will survive, and then they will reproduce. Okay, so this is the survival of the fittest. In nature, a given habitat, it has enough resources to support a maximum possible number of population or individual. Beyond that limit, there can be no further growth that is possible. And this limit, it can be taken as the nature's carrying capacity. The capacity of the nature to an extent that the nature can carry the individuals and provide them with the resources that they need. So this nature's carrying capacity, it can be taken as K. Now when a population grows in an habitat with limited resources, initially the graph that is seen, it is in a lag phase. And then it is followed by a sudden acceleration, that is the log or the exponential phase where the population grows exponentially. And then comes the declaration phase when the population it reaches the carrying capacity of the nature. That means this is the maximum carrying capacity of the nature, and beyond this the nature cannot carry. Okay, this is known as the stationary phase. Now a plot of this population density n related to the time t, it results into a sigmoid curve. This is known as a sigmoid curve, which is seen in the logistic growth. So these are the two growth models that you have to study. Next, let us move to population interaction